My dear audience, this by far might be the best gaming CPU we've seen in years by AMD or even Intel. Not only are we achieving phenomenal gaming performance with today's processor in question, but also excellent efficiency. In other words, the CPU can be described as extremely power efficient in all use cases. We are talking of none other than the AMD Ryzen 7 7800X 3D CPU equipped with 8 cores and 16 threads, and of course, lots of the popular 3D V-cache. As good as the CPU in today's limelight may be, it unfortunately also comes with a few weaknesses, which we too are going to cover in this video. Price. In late July 2023, we have to spend $440 to $450 for the 7800X 3D. The comparable regular model 7700X easily goes for $100 less. In return, the price of Intel's i7 13700K is roughly on par with today's X3D processor. Today's test and comparison should therefore turn out quite interesting. First of all, we need to clarify what exactly I mean by best gaming CPU. In fact, we are talking performance here and not so much value for money, because if you want to game as cheaply as possible, you could simply go ahead and choose a CPU in a more attractive price range. Architecture. As it's been the case so far, I'd like to point out that a 7800X 3D and 7700X come with the same core and thread count of 8 and 16 respectively. The 7800X 3D, though, features a fat, powerful layer of additional L3 cache. The 7700X offering a respectable 32 MB, the 7800X 3D a whopping 96 MB. Unlike the 7900X 3D, the 7800X 3D only comes equipped with a single 8-core CCD, not a 6-core CCD, so in theory it should perform better in a few games out there. In theory, of course, that is. Overall, today's X3D 8-core is running with less L3 cache than the 12-core part, but when looking at it from a different perspective, it also offers the largest amount per core. Unlike its X3D siblings, the 7800X 3D's TDP increased compared to the 7700X. We are coming from 105 to 120 watts, but this doesn't necessarily mean higher power draw, so don't jump to conclusions just yet. Although I'm repeating myself, I want to point out that the 3D V-cache cannot withstand a lot of heat, which is why AMD lowered the max temperature from its original 95 degrees down to 89 degrees Celsius. Test setup. As for the motherboard, I went with the ASRock B650E Steel Legend. As for the RAM, it's the Kingston Fury Beast RGB with 32GB at 6000 MHz and CL36 timings. Cooling-wise, I went with my usual Be Quiet Pure Loop 2FX 360mm AIO liquid cooler. The graphics card being the ASUS RTX 3090 Tough Gaming OC. But I would like to warn you in advance that this caused a few obvious bottlenecks for me. I did additionally settle for a workaround though: clock speeds. Now this is where things start getting exciting. When all 8 cores are put to work, there is a relatively large difference between the 7800X 3D and 7700X. We are talking about 400 MHz lower clock speeds on the X3D part. The difference becomes even greater as far as the boost clocks are concerned. The 7700X clocks almost a whopping 500 MHz higher. In fact, we are also reading out significantly lower clock speeds with the 7800X 3D while gaming, but as everyone knows, it's not all about high clock speeds when it comes to how well a CPU ultimately performs. But what's definitely clear is that with the 7700X, we should enjoy noticeably higher multi-threaded performance. For instance, primarily in productive use cases. That's what we'll dive right into now. Performance, productivity. Cinebench R23. The 7800X 3D is clearly 8% behind the 7700X in the multi-core run. To my surprise, even 11% in the single-core test. On the other hand, a 13700K in the multi-core test achieves a whopping 71% higher score thanks to its significantly higher number of cores and threads, and a 19% better score in this single-core run. You'd think one should compare against the i5 13600K, but that one happens to be noticeably cheaper than the 7800X 3D, whereas the 13700K and 7800X 3D are practically comparable in price. The 7-zip benchmark doesn't necessarily paint a prettier picture. Although the X3D and X part hardly differ that much from each other, the 13700K still being about 30% faster though. In V-Ray 5, the X3D lags behind the X variant by about 7%. Intel, on the other hand, positions itself 49% ahead of AMD's offering. The Corona benchmark goes to show a tie between the 7700X and 7800X 3D. Unsurprisingly, the i7 finishes the task 35% faster. Blender Open Data. Unfortunately, the X3D version here too drops behind the 7700X by 8%. Meanwhile, the 13700K enjoys a massive 64% lead. In Handbrake, the 7800X 3D performs 7% worse than its 7700X sibling. Intel's 13700K does a 36% quicker job. Last but not least, Vegas Pro 20 video rendering. Again, I found that a 7800X 3D renders 10 to 11% slower than the 7700X does. Here too, the 13700K emerges as the winner by completing the same task 32% sooner. Gaming. First of all, at the usual resolutions of 1080p and 1440p. However, we are already running into one or the other GPU bottleneck with an RTX 3090, and that's a GPU that can be described as fairly powerful overall, which is why the gaps between those X3D and regular CPUs sometimes are hard to present. Not an easy job. In the future, I'm planning on getting a much more powerful graphics card for tests of this kind. Until then, I'll be running through 3 test instances, 1080p, 1440p, and infamously 720p, to at least somewhat work around that nasty GPU bottleneck I experienced. Assassin's Creed Valhalla. The 7800X 3D already taking the lead. It on average performs 6% better than the 7700X or Intel's 13700K. Borderlands 3. Here we are looking at much more worthwhile improvements. X3D conjuring up 16% higher FPS than the XQ and 9% more than a 13700K. The 1% lows are 19 and 4% higher respectively. Cyberpunk 2077. With the 7800X 3D, we're looking at 7% better values compared to the X CPU. Also 10% higher lows. However, Intel remains in the lead with the 13700K by 4 and 19% respectively. Nonetheless, a remarkable result. In Far Cry 6, there is a small struggle for power going on between the 7800X 3D and 13700K, one that Intel wins due to its nearly 10% higher 1% lows. Nonetheless, it must be pointed out that the X3D is capable of offering 14% more frames per second in the averages and also 12% smoother lows as opposed to the regular X counterpart. Forza Horizon 5. Here it is almost impossible to distinguish realistically between the X3D and X models. However, one can point out that Intel is 8% behind on average, which is even a whopping 20% in the 1% lows. GTA 5 can and should probably be skipped entirely. The game engine doesn't seem to be going beyond what we are already achieving. Horizon Zero Dawn then goes to show minor improvements. The 7800X 3D performing 3% better than a 7700X, 5% as far as lows are concerned, and 7% and 11% higher FPS than the 13700K respectively. Metro Exodus. The X3D chip performs practically as well as its regular X counterpart here. On average, Intel offering comparable values, but being 5% ahead in the lows though. Red Dead Redemption 2. Here we are witnessing yet another power struggle between Intel and AMD. Even though the 13700K leads by a mere 2% on average, the 7800X 3D brings 12% smoother 1% lows to the table, so it practically takes the lead. The 7700X falling behind the X3D chip by 3 and 21% respectively. Rise of the Tomb Raider, X3D performing 3% better, 5 to 6% better in the 1% low aspect. Intel is slightly behind here by 3 or 4%. Shadow of the Tomb Raider makes these speed demons look practically equally as good, which of course also has something to do with my GPU bottleneck. Gaming average FPS of the 1080p and 1440p tests. The 7800X 3D is 5% ahead of the 7700X here, and 6% in terms of 1% lows. So on average, the 13700K performs 3% worse than a 7800X 3D, 1 or 2% when it comes to 1% lows. But since these results are only partially meaningful, we are now moving on to the gaming results of the 720p tests. Assassin's Creed Valhalla. The 7800X 3D is obviously one of the top dog CPUs here, even though there's barely any noteworthy difference between the 7700X and its X3D counterpart. The 13700K dropping behind by a mere 4%, which wouldn't even be 3% in the 1% lows. Borderlands 3. Here, X3D distances itself from its regular X counterpart by a substantial 33%. As far as the 1% lows are concerned, we are talking of an increase of almost 39%. Intel's 13700K lags behind the X3D by 16%, and that's 17% in the lows. Cyberpunk 2077. Intel with their 13700K obviously claw their way to the #1 spot here, probably mainly due to the higher number of cores and threads from which the game seems to be benefiting quite well. So the i7 performs 22% better than the 7800X 3D and a respectable 37% in terms of minimums. Still, the 3D V-cache still shows a strong impact with the same number of cores, the X3D CPU offering a 15% higher average FPS and 8% higher lows. Far Cry 6, the X3D delivering a 21% higher average result and 15% as far as lows are concerned compared to a 7700X. Still, the 13700K positions itself 3 and even 11% respectively ahead of AMD's speedy 8-core processor. Forza Horizon 5 then goes to show fairly insignificant changes/improvements. Perhaps one could mention the slightly higher minimum values. After all, we report a lead of 8% over the 13700K. GTA 5 can actually be skipped here yet again. Minimal gains in the low aspect, that's all. The 7800X 3D wins the race in the game title Horizon Zero Dawn, X3D being 8% ahead of the 7700X and 16% as far as lows are concerned, and nearly 7% and another 7% ahead in lows of Intel's i7. Metro Exodus shows calmer results. Basically, the CPUs perform equally well here. You can hardly differentiate. The same isn't quite true in the title Red Dead Redemption 2, because here, AMD with their X3D 8-core part achieves a performance increase of 11%, but unfortunately, no significant jump in the 1% lows measurable. Intel is averaging 3% behind with its 13700K and 5% in the lows. Rise of the Tomb Raider. Moving from the 7700X to the 7800X 3D, we are reporting an 8% increase in frame rate, and as far as the lows go, even 14%. However, the 13700K is not far behind the X3D, namely 3% and just 1% respectively. The finale and Shadow of the Tomb Raider is less impressive. On average, there are barely any gaps. Still, the X3D processor bringing almost 22% smoother lows to the table compared to its X counterpart. Intel, on the other hand, dropping behind by only 4%. That's negligible. Gaming average FPS of the 720p tests. With the addition of 3D V-cache, AMD's Zen 4 8-core achieves an 8% FPS increase on average and 13% smoother 1% lows. In fact, Intel is keeping up very well with their 13700K, only dropping behind the 7800X 3D by a mere 1 or 2%. But why did it make so much noise at the beginning of the video regarding best gaming CPU and whatnot? The following test results you are about to see will answer your questions: power consumption and temperatures. Here it becomes clear where the greatest strength of the Ryzen 7 with 3D cache lies. While the other remaining Intel and AMD CPUs consume a lot of power, the 7800X 3D, all things considered, draws fairly little power from the wall. The X3D 8-core consumes 60 watts or 26% less than a 7700X at full load. If we now compare the 7800X 3D with the 13700K, the i7 already draws 274 watts or 158% more power. Well, at full load, that is. And of course, we shouldn't ignore the fact that the 13700K on average also offers 71% more raw performance to work with, mainly due to its higher core count. When idling, the CPUs in question barely differ. One could even say the i7 consumes a tiny bit more, but that are all values when idling or when putting heavy load onto all cores. While gaming, we're looking at completely different values. I'm always surprised by the fact how much the CPU alone affects the power draw when gaming. The 7800X 3D already consuming 42 watts or 8% less than the 7700X while gaming, and that's while offering quite a bit higher performance. If you include the 13700K in the comparison, that one draws a whopping 105 watts or 22% more power in the very same gaming session. In my opinion, that's not something you should just ignore. The temperatures, therefore, are of course much more of a challenge to cope with when getting the i7. Thankfully, the 7800X 3D does continue to run cooler than its X counterpart, even out of the box. Conclusion: I stand by my opinion that the Ryzen 7 7800X 3D is one of the best gaming CPUs out there. The decisive factor here is not just the great gaming performance, but also its extremely low power consumption. Compared to the regular 7700X and especially the 13700K, today's 7800X 3D can be considered a real efficiency beast. The difference in power draw not only gets affected at full load, but also during gaming. And that combination, along with the offered performance, makes the 7800X 3D so attractive. However, only for the gamers among you. Because if you happen to depend a little more on raw performance for video editing, rendering, streaming and whatnot, you will probably end up much happier with a 13700K. The only downer is that the i7 consumes a lot of power, which even after optimizations is still looking worse than with those mentioned AMD CPUs right now. Also, it needs to be said that in the case of the 7800X 3D, as far as productive workloads are concerned, quite a lot of raw performance is lost due to the noticeably lower clock speeds compared to the 7700X. But either way, the 13700K remains unbeaten in that use case at its price point. However, all those who are primarily looking for a highly efficient gaming CPU will end up very happy with the AMD Ryzen 7 7800X 3D. With that said, thank you so much for watching, and until the next one.